Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. If this is your first time listening, my colleague and Amanda and I, we host a new wellness guest every week, and then we release our new episodes on Sundays. So be sure to subscribe, follow, leave us comments and feedback. We love when our community does that as well. Last week, Chris Leonard returned, and he and we met one-on-one because if you're first time listening, Amanda is out taking care of a new baby, so it's just me and guests right now until she returns in middle of fall. But Chris joined me and we talked about the impact of the criminal justice system on substance use healing and recovery. So if you missed that one, it was actually a couple weeks ago. We've had a guest cancellation, and so Lesley and we had rescheduled for this week. So that was 2 weeks ago, but it was our last posted episode. But Dr. Lesley Cook, she joins us again. She's a return guest. She's bringing another topic that she specializes in her own work. So we're going to be talking about how parents can support their children on their coming out journey. So welcome back, Lesley. I can speak on behalf of Amanda because she was so sad that she couldn't join us, but she also, like I said, has other things in her hands right now. But we both welcome you back and thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me again. What a lovely reason to have to miss a podcast recording to hold a tiny human.
It's the sweetest. I'm enjoying when she took her time and, to kind of settle in things, and then she exchanged some pictures of the little one with me, and it's just so sweet. So I look forward to her joining us, but she is settling into motherhood. So for us too, if you don't mind, Lesley, can you give just another brief intro for somebody if they didn't catch our initial episode with you?
Sure. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Virginia. I have about 12 years now post license work, predominantly with LGBTQ individuals and / neurodivergent individuals. So I work with a lot of kids, teens and adults who have 2 or more diagnoses, so ADHD, autism, learning disorders, auditory processing challenges, and then also who happen to be on either a coming out journey themselves or have been out for quite a while. The intersection of those 2 groups is a really underserved population, and that's really where my career has taken me. And I do both individual therapy, family therapy, and I also do assessment now.
Very cool. Thank you again. So yeah, we touched on when Dr. Lesley joined us the first time, we touched more on the neurodivergence and that topic. So today we'll touch, like I said in our intro, how parents can support children coming out. So for us to jump right in, if you don't mind, can we start with just the concept that we're kind of seeing in our society and how being a sexual or gender minority, how that's not a trend to say that about ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that number one, it's a common feeling, especially from outside of that group. So I don't blame anyone who would see the rising rates of individuals expressing different gender labels than we've heard before, or coming out very early. We had a lot of the same feelings about ADHD when we got that diagnostic category really buttoned up. There were a lot of people concerned about it being a trend or being popular. And the science doesn't really bear that out. So that's good news. It's not a trend. If you are, in fact, a heterosexual person, it's very unlikely that you would just pick a different sexuality because it's popular. It just doesn't work like that. And that's really good news that I get to give to parents all the time, because we can kind of move away from that concern and really join with our kids and other people when they start to express these differences. What we think is really happening is that our language is changing. That's really all that we're talking about. Our ways to describe how people feel about their sex assigned at birth, about their gender identity, and about their expression of gender, which is totally different than their identity. We just have more words for those things. Mm-hmm. And that's increasing the visibility of everyone across the spectrum.
I love this. And I know in past episodes, we've given people kind of a breakdown of vocabulary and terminology. And Do you mind differentiating what those being, sex versus gender, and kind of how those are different things for our community who are newer to this language?
Yeah. So sex assigned at birth is a term that we use for what sex the child was assigned by the physician or the doctor who did an ultrasound. It's pretty much based on external characteristics. There's nothing wrong with a sex assigned at birth. That's one of the medical pieces of information that you get. We just know that it's not always accurate, and there is a very large range of where individuals will go in terms of gender, even within the same category of sex assigned at birth. Then there's gender identity, and that's really who you feel you are. And so I am a cisgendered person. So I was assigned female. I feel consistent with being female. I have never wondered if I was male. So that's my identity, my gender identity. And then we have gender expression, which is how we choose to communicate our gender or our perceptions of ourselves or how we feel about ourselves to the world. And that is a whole other category. So I am a cisgendered woman in gender identity, but I really enjoy playing with a variety of ways to express that. So my biggest dream in life, and all my kids know this, is to own a burgundy tailored suit.
Oh,
there's something about that.
I love
So
that. I can see it now. You need one.
I do need one. I need to do that. And so that's a kind of an easier way to explain it. Where we would see it most often with clients or families that come in is perhaps a child who identifies as non-binary in identity, so isn't comfortable with male or female designations, but perhaps they dress exclusively in dresses. And so parents may be confused by that and say, well, but I thought they weren't binary, and they're not. But their identity and their expression are really two different trajectories.
Yes. And I think, yeah, our language is changing, and I feel like it's something that's becoming, I love the impact that, and as people know, when Lesley joined us the first time, we were talking about, good old TikTok. It comes up almost every single episode that we record nowadays, but having this information, it's like more widespread, like the language, the change in language is getting out there. And then with these platforms nowadays, I feel like it's way more easily accessible, even for those who aren't surrounded by those using the language or being affirming of these things. So I don't know, like, if your opinion on that, and I know obviously you're a creator on TikTok, so it's, I think, a beautiful thing that is out there nowadays for this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really brings a lot of, especially when we're talking about children and teens, into my office for mental health challenges is when they don't have a way to see themselves in others. I'm seeing a large uptick of non-binary kids coming in. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because they're having challenges. Part of it is because they're seeing other people like them and thinking, perhaps this is why I feel different, and want to explore that. And so I think social media in general and TikTok has the potential to do both things, to increase visibility and access and information. And that can help not only the kids and teens that I see, but parents, because parents can see that, okay, this is not made up, this is not a trend, connect to other parents. It does have the potential sometimes to generate conflict as well. There's other opinions on TikTok, and so that can be challenging for teens if they can't regulate what they're going to see on their feed. Mm-hmm. They can also encounter a lot of negative images about gender expression, gender identity. So we're really navigating this whole new world.
Yes. And I, on my own platform, and I know I'm familiar obviously with yours, and creating that safe space where, I always love all of your response videos that you'll do to people's comments and questions. And obviously on that platform, or any platform, we always say, please seek out your own providers, and here's some resources, because this is not an actual service being provided clinically, but yeah, some things coming from a place of hate out there, just as much as people creating safe spaces, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yep. It's a new world, which is a phrase I get to say all the time in therapy with parents.
Yeah, I bet though. Like, because whenever you hear that, like, another wording of this point where it's not a trend, I also hear that it's a lifestyle choice.
Mhm.
Like, oh no, like,
Yeah.
it, it, people don't wake up and say, I'm gonna identify as this today. Like, it's not something that you can then choose. And I can go on and on about it, but yeah, it's not a lifestyle choice. It's not a trend or a phase that
Mhm.
person is going through. Something very real and within themselves.
Exactly. And I think parents do get confused sometimes, and maybe individuals too, between the idea of it's a phase or that things could change over time, because those are actually two separate things. So a phase would be something that is like I'm going through something, and so I'm expressing my conflict through this act. Like I really wanted an eyebrow ring when I was 17 because I was going through a lot. And that would have been, for me, a phase because it wasn't something that persisted, and it was more of an expression, a way to gain control of a life at that point at 17, like most of our lives are, was kind of in a little bit of emotional turmoil. So that's what phases are. It's a way to cope. And also phases are normal. I think I went through a phase of wearing only burgundy for like 6 months. That was interesting.
You're like, oh,
And
circling back. Now I want a burgundy suit.
exactly.
Back
Just
to.
my first pair. Birkenstocks were just going all the way back to the 90s. But that's different than gender expression and identity changing over time, especially as people discover better language. That does happen. So when parents come in and they're concerned about it being a phase, what I do try to tell them is the good news is you don't need to worry about whether it's a phase or not. It doesn't help to get stuck there. This may change over time. Just like all of us, as we grow, we don't remain static. So it is possible for someone to identify um, as non-binary, and then in terms of their gender identity, and as they get older, they may find another label to be more effective, like genderqueer, gender fluid, or perhaps they will identify as a trans man or woman. That's okay too, because what you want to think of is the person is not necessarily changing. The language is getting more specific, and that is always a good thing.
Yes, and they're finding it's like you're aligning with what resonates or what fits with you the best in that moment. And that's great that somebody actually has found something, because I can only, like, that turmoil going and like going on inside of them, and then finding something that helps them feel some clarity, some understanding, some it's looking at it like that, like that's what this is for them. And if that does change, that just means that they found something even more deeply that resonates with them or feels even more authentic to them.
Mhm.
And you hear, that changing over time and I think you hear it a lot with, or I can speak for my own practice, and I'll start working with somebody and they might identify as bisexual. And then as they delve into their own sexuality more and do some of their own, work, exploration, healing, then they might find out that they'll identify as lesbian.
Mhm.
They have, gathered more information and even more clarity around that.
Yeah, and what I say to parents in that situation is the person actually hasn't changed at all. It's not that they were bi and now they are gay. It's that they are who they are. And sometimes it takes quite a while to figure out what the language is that fits for you. I think parents often get really concerned about, are they changing from this person to this person to this person, even for trans individuals. So am I losing my son? Is my son dying and this daughter is appearing? No, your child has always been your child. But what we're doing now is we're specifying how we're going to refer to them, what their identity is. It's really just language more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna bring up that concept because of what you see and how you approach it with trans children, teens with their parents. So yeah, like their foundational identity, because I hear that very often, or parents refusing to like dead naming, like refusing to, call their child by, their excuse me, chosen pronouns, and, new name for their identity. And that I've heard parents, describe it as like, I need time to grieve the loss of my child. And I'm like, oh goodness. So I'm sure you into that.
Yeah, I think we're really focusing on language today too, which is, I think, helpful, and I hope it's helpful to people. What I do with parents is I try to guide that language a little bit and say, the feeling of what you're describing is incredibly valid, because anytime something turns out different than we thought, we can have a grief process. But you're not grieving your child, you're grieving your expectations and your ideas and this path that you had imagined. Now, that might also happen if we have a child who is in college and then mid-college drops out and decides they want to be an artist instead of an engineer. If they were there may also be that feeling on the parent side of a grief, but we would never tell that child that I'm grieving the loss of my child, right? So I think we just apply this very interestingly to gender in a way that's unique, potentially because it's still new, historically speaking, in our culture. But really, when you're talking to your child, it's important, if you're going to use the word grieving, to use the phrase that I'm grieving my expectations. I'm grieving the path that I had envisioned. We don't want to attach grief to the child because it's actually something to celebrate. And it can, using your child's proper name and pronouns can be life-saving, and often is life-saving. So you can take time to grieve your expectations, but you should not delay using new names and pronouns, even if those will change over time.
Yes. And the impact that, the more, like, we're putting this information out there for a reason. And, I get the teens that are, I don't work with younger children, but teens that are in front of me. And before I've gotten to connect, with a parent and educate this and, kind of bring them together on this, it's so, like you said, it is life-saving. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's somebody, a primary caregiver in their life, and it could be very traumatic to hear, like, oh, that essentially is, can plant that seed for them that they are, not worthy. Their self-worth, all of these things about themselves. It's like, okay, well, I don't exist to you anymore. I'm less now. Whenever for them, it's a very, like I said, authentic, and we want that to be that experience for them.
Yeah, I think the last study that I read said that the protective factor of having accepting, loving caregivers is at 1. You only need 1. It'd be great if you had more than 1. I don't think it's great to only have 1, but even if you are the only person who is accepting, so let's say there's other extended family, there's teachers who aren't giving them a hard time, if you can be that 1, you will protect your child from a lot of emotional damage that they could encounter otherwise. I think the other thing to remember too is that when we have children, we're essentially engaging in this contract that we're bringing this child into the world, and we are going to teach and guide them, but they do have to have their own life. And so I find a lot of parents too might need assistance and some gentle coaching to remember that the child is not a reflection of you or your worth. They are allowed to branch away. In fact, that's really the measure of successful parenting, is that they feel comfortable telling us who they are and what they want to be in the world. And so if that happens for you, if your child comes to you and tells you that they are gay or they are bi or they are trans or they are non-binary, you have succeeded in some way. You have created an environment where they feel comfortable enough, even though it's scary, to tell you who they are and what they want to be.
I am obsessed with this because so many things, obvious reasons, but I feel that my brain, and I could be totally off base here, but my brain instantly went to generational trauma. And like, as a parent, I've produced this human And then if I haven't done my own healing, and this human that I've produced comes to me, and it's like what they're going to college for, or the sports that they're playing, or if that's different from it goes back to those expectations, but also separating from the parent. And I love the way that reframe that you use. Like if they do those things and they're sharing that part of themselves and their life with you, like that's incredible and to be celebrated.
And it's a gift. A child coming to a parent before they are 18 or before they've moved out and sharing something that vulnerable is a gift to that parent. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Not all kids are able to do that. So if you've created an environment for your child to do that, then give yourself a pat on the back.
For sure. And I've had unfortunately, and my fair share of working with clients, and they don't have that safety, and we don't have any open-mindedness or a parent being receptive and viewing that as a gift. And sometimes it feels like every day just feels like every session we're focused on surviving within that environment, that is hurting us essentially. But then there's always that flip side of the coin, and that's why we do what we do.
And therapists can be the one person as a protective factor, and so can teachers and coaches and bus drivers and cafeteria people, and friends' parents. So it doesn't have to be just a parent. As long as that person has one space to exist authentically in, we do tend to see that protective factor raised significantly. And if we're talking about gender specifically, one of the hardest statistics to talk about, especially when we're talking about kind of children and adolescents, is one of the most important, and that's that some of the data that we have does suggest that up to 50% of trans individuals at some point decide to try to end their life over their lifetime. But the other side of that coin is the 50% that don't. This is what we see, is that they had at least one space to live authentically. So you can, just by accepting, honoring names and pronouns, providing a safe space to talk about a girlfriend or a boyfriend that they're with, or a partner, you can actually decrease someone's risk of self-harm or not being alive just by being in their presence.
Yes, and it's a painful but important statistic to bring up, especially with September being world, with yesterday or 2 days ago being World Suicide Prevention Day, and this month being very important for those things. So let's get into common myths surrounding children being sexual or gender identity minorities.
Sure. I think one of the biggest myths that I encounter a lot is when younger children start to express concern or thoughts about potentially being trans or non-binary, parents get very concerned that they are going to be put on medication or have surgery. That's often the first thing I hear is, well, I don't want to do this because I don't want my child to have surgery or take medicine. It's very important for people to understand that we don't perform sex reassignment surgery on children. That is not something we do in this country. We do provide affirmative care, but that often starts with individual support and social transition. So potentially changing names and pronouns, changing how someone dresses to be in alignment with who they really are. We don't even look at hormone blockers, which are the first medical step, really. So they're not a medication. They're not additional hormones. They're not an additional medication. What they can do is they can block some of the hormone that is creating the external gender characteristics that are incorrect for the person. So potentially as a child moves through puberty, they could, so older children, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, some of those children will be found to be appropriate for hormone blockers, which just basically slow down the puberty process. If children are very clear that they are trans very young, that is also a potentially life-saving intervention, because it is not dangerous to the child, and it can reduce the dysphoria, which is that feeling of knowing who you are, but looking in the mirror and seeing something else. Or so a trans child, a trans female child, would slow down or prevent that child from all of a sudden developing large amounts of facial hair or a deeper voice. And that can be a really important part. After blockers, if a child is what we call consistent and persistent in their presentation, if they've had time and they get older, then they can receive cross-gender hormones. Though again, those are all monitored by physicians. They are relatively, actually very safe because of the levels that are provided, and they're only provided to children who meet very specific criteria. And at this point, we're talking about adolescents, not even children. And they're very closely monitored. But even at those ages, so now we're talking about 16, 17, 18 years old, not all of those children will remain on hormones. Some of them will transition into other procedures like laser hair removal or perhaps looking at surgery, but not all will. And so the big fear of my 9-year-old is expressing concern about potentially not being a boy. And I don't want to acknowledge that because I don't want them to have surgery. That is a myth. We don't have to worry about that. It's a very long and careful process. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
No, I love, because that's a part of the process that I'm not as super familiar with. And I'm sure, a lot of the community that's listening, some probably some aren't. So, and I loved how the theme that keeps coming up with these points is how life-saving these things are. Like, of course, it's not going to jump right to, a reassignment surgery or, anything like that. And I think putting that out there is helpful, but helping parents understand what goes on internally and emotionally, physically and emotionally, just holistically with that dysphoria and what that really means and the impact of that is critical.
Yeah. And I think tied in with that too, the idea of, if I do this and they change their mind, I will have damaged them forever. That also doesn't get borne out, that the process of this is actually quite long. If you talk to any trans individual who's been through the process of medical reassignment, it is a very, very long and drawn out process. So there are checks and balances, there are spaces for people. Also, not all trans children or adults will want any procedures. Some individuals don't want anything done medically. Some people want some processes and hormones and some don't. So it's not a one size fits all situation. Another myth is that if someone is expressing that they are gay or bi at a young age or trans at a young age, that means they must have been traumatized. That's a very common myth that I hear is, well, this is because of that thing that happened 2 years ago. And we know from the literature that many, many, many people suffer traumas that could impact our self-concept or our sexual or gender identity, but that does not correlate with whether people are a part of the LGBTQ community. And the reason I think that's so important to mention is that when a child has suffered some kind of trauma, and this then is also in their path, many, many, many parents blame themselves. So not only are they not allowing their child to express themselves as they are, they're also beating up on their own self. So it's incredibly important for me when I work with parents to help them understand those are not linked, and you cannot cause that.
And I feel like my brain quickly made this association between how that can connect with the stigma that's around our society and the LGBTQ plus community. Like people, it's always they othered, and I got to hurry up, and we got to what is it that happened, so that way I can identify something to fix. And it's like that's not the case.
Yeah, and we, I hate to say this because it's an awful way to get data, but we've got a really robust set of data now from the past 30 years that therapies that are intended to, and I'm making air quotes, right, to heal the trauma that caused someone to be gay or trans is not only not effective, but it's incredibly damaging. It doesn't work. You can't change that from the outside. It's not due to trauma. I mean, we have enough data now to say that as mental health professionals, very, very certainly, that don't try to put your child in any kind of therapy process to fix their gender identity or sexuality.
I watched a this is like a clinical recommendation, but that documentary on Netflix, it's specifically about conversion therapy and different, and it shows both sides of, the perspectives of it, and those who are stand behind it and support it, and then those who have survived it, and they call them survivors because of how detrimental those types of treatments can be for those individuals.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to love your kid.
Yes, thank you. Okay, any other myths at all that come to mind before we move to our last point before we do our outro? Wrap up.
I think that the myth that I'm seeing the most right now is that somehow, because there are more acronyms, more gender identities, I hear that a lot with folks now saying, well, now there's just everybody's something. And this is just kind of Gen Z and how they're expressing themselves. And I will say it's half a myth. The part of the myth that's not a myth is that some of this is Gen Z. I jokingly say at least once a week, Gen Z will save the world. Part of this is a generation that is trying to throw off all of the rules in a way that I think was needed in this area. And so, yes, there are going to be, especially with pronouns, there's things called neopronouns, which are really brand new. Z, Zer, there's all kinds of names. And so parents feel bombarded by all of this new information. Especially I struggle with parents that have a hard time with they, them pronouns as singular. How can they be a they? That they, it's great. It's like
It's not that's not grammatically correct. And I'm like,
yeah, and language changes. So the part of the myth that is true is that in a way, Gen Z is trying to really explode the boundaries on all of this. But the part of it that's a myth is that this is inherently bad or inherently attention seeking or inherently everyone wants a trophy. That's the myth that I hear a lot. It's actually quite effective. And we've done this many times in our culture's history in this country. When something really needs realignment, the first step is often to just blow the doors off and really expand this concept linguistically. So you don't need to worry if you're a parent that your child is only doing this for attention. Instead, you can view it as this generation are pioneers, and they are out in a wilderness figuring out names for new trees and streams and mountains and things that have always existed. They just never had a name. I joked with my mother once because she asked, I have a non-binary child. She asked, well, how do you understand all this? And I said, well, can you think of someone in your life that you remember as like, I know that that's the gender they use, but it just doesn't. And she said immediately, absolutely, in college, this girl and this and this and this. And I said, I imagine that perhaps now there's a label for how she felt and moved through the world. That helped it click for her as, oh, it's always been there. We just didn't have a name.
Yes, that connection, that light bulb moment for people is huge. And putting it in, terminology or using those metaphors or comparisons for people and it helps those who don't understand it to get a little bit of an understanding of like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense when you word it that way. I feel like a lot of people can, because it's overwhelming for them, they don't regulate themselves. So then they just react and you're like, wait, can we just wait a minute? Like, just take a second. I made a talk a while, I don't know, I think earlier this week about just different generations, and the earlier, the young generation right now, and all of the things that they're questioning and breaking through and deconstructing. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. And so one of the best things you can do as a parent is, if something seems outlandish or strange or you just don't understand, ask your child to tell you about it. Have them tell you, almost like they explored a land you've never been to and you really want to understand all about it. That will do wonders.
I say, like, how does it feel for us? That's a different topic, like plants for me. Like, I love plants. Like, if somebody wants to sit and talk with me about plants, like, let's talk about plants. Like, let's do it. And I'll show you my plants and what kinds I like and what ones I'm not the most successful caring for, and like what ones I think would be best for you if you're asking. Like, and just ask them, because that's what they want. They want somebody, to want to have access and understanding and see them for those things.
Yeah. We're all just looking for connection.
Yes. So our last point before we wrap up and everything will be just, we've kind of touched on some of these, I think, but it'd be a good kind of summary area and anything that comes to mind for you, Lesley. But what to expect and what is an affirming response across each point in a child's lifespan. So we kind of touched on them kind of out, not necessarily in an order, but we could package that up for folks and what to expect a little bit over the course of that lifespan.
Sure. So young children, below the age of 5 and 6 are in an exploratory phase. So anything that children mention or behavior, like wanting to dress in clothing that is not typically assigned to their gender, or toys they want to play with, this is exploratory time. So you don't have to feel like you are burdened to ask a lot of questions or try to figure it out. If a child says, I might not be a girl, you can just ask them, oh, well, tell me more about that, or what's that like, or that's cool. But you don't have to fix or solve. When children are very young, it's okay to just let them explore. When children start asserting themselves, so about 6 years old, and if they come to you telling you things, that's the time to respond immediately with, thank you for telling me. What can I do? You want to talk about it? Would you like to talk to someone whose job it is to know about this? You want to give them options, because some children at that age may want to say something to you, but they might not want to make any change. Don't have to rush into change. The most important thing in that younger age is not to squash it, is not to say no and don't say that again, because that can lead to many years of being closeted or having internal stress. When we're talking about preteens or teens, we can be a little more directive. So again, we always want to start with, thank you for telling me, how can I help? And then following through is the big one. So if they ask you for something, please use this name, just use the name. It's okay. It may change. They may change back to their other name. They may change to another name. But we want to show them with our behavior at that preteen and teen age that we are behind them. And also teens and young adults, if your child comes and tells you these things, we want to do those 3 steps. And then we also want to help connect them to community. It's very important as gender and sexual minority individuals age, that they are connected to safe places and others besides the family that can be a place where they can go to get information and support.
And so many things that come to my mind, but obviously we're at the end. But I feel like it's not about a power struggle, or we have to, suppress this. Like you said earlier, we all are wired for connection. How can I connect with my child, my teen, my friend, my coworker on this with them?
Yeah. And you're not going to change the trajectory by being open. You're not going to encourage it or create something that's not already there. So parents can really take that responsibility off and just focus on connecting with your child and listening to what their needs are.
And as we ask every guest, as we wrap up and before we end things here, do you have any last minute thoughts, mantras, sayings, or a tidbit of information that you would like to leave our community with before we sign off? It's like putting people on the spot. It doesn't have to be this philosophical. Some people are like, oh my gosh.
I have too many. That's the issue. I think, in all of my work with LGBT individuals, there is something that is common for every single person, and that is that they want their mom or dad or grandma to love them and accept them. That more than anything else that we talk about, more than resolution of trauma or transition or boyfriends or girlfriends or partners. They just want someone to look at them and say, I love you and I accept you as you are. And so if you do nothing else, if that's the only thing you can do for someone that you have succeeded in a way that is far more powerful than any book you could give or information or data. Just letting people know that they have a space in this world where someone else sees them for who they are and loves them. Bring that energy out.
Yes, please. So thank you so much again for joining us again. And you're always a wealth of information, and it's amazing. And as Amanda and I, every time we're like, if you ever have anything else that you would like to cover, we would be happy to schedule you again. And might be another handful of months, but we're always happy to have you back with us.
Well, I'm always happy to come and talk to you all. I think the topics that you cover are just wonderful and add a lot to the community. So thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much. So everybody, don't forget to make sure if you like, subscribe, follow, like I said in the introduction, please leave us feedback. If there's if there's certain topics that we haven't covered yet that you would love for us to seek out and cover, please leave us that feedback, because we try to have as many diverse and broad topics we like to cover, anything that could be tied to individual wellness. So leave that for us in any comments. Next week, we will be having another installment of our trauma and chakra healing series. It's always a mouthful for me every time I try to say it out loud. But Lisa Schaefer, she's going to be back. We'll be covering chakra next week. So you don't want to miss that. And then, sure, there it is. So Lisa will be back, and then that episode will release next Sunday. So everybody take care. Have a good rest of your week.